Vice Chancellor, Honorable Chair, distinguished guest speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, I would like to start off by asking you a very important question, which is, why do you think Sri Lanka has not witnessed a single terrorist attack since the end of the war? And why do I ask this? Now, Sri Lanka marked a very important historic event in 2009, May 2009, which led to the complete end of terror attacks with the death of the leader, Velupille Prabhakaran of the LTTE, and a complete crippling of the notorious terrorist group which was responsible for so many deaths and so many atrocious attacks in the country. Now, why do I ask this question? It's because that if we look at the global experiences of other terrorist groups around the world, we see that the Sri Lankan case is extremely unique. In many other countries, when the state forces kill a terrorist leader, most of the times the terrorist leaders are killed, but the remaining terrorists, they come back with more attacks, and it leads to a great backlash of violence. But in this case, Sri Lanka was unique because there was no single attacks since the end of the humanitarian operations. So my research will look at why this was in the case of Sri Lanka. Now, the research question I will look at is in two sessions. The question is, why have we not witnessed the terrorist attacks? And secondly, is Prabhakaran's death a precursor to the end of terrorism in this country? Now, since the end of the war, there has not been much research done on this area, which is why I thought it was very important on this occasion to look at these pertinent issues. Now, in order to look at these issues, I have relied on what is called an adversary threat matrix. This is a very crucial model, especially for terrorism analysts like us, and this was, of course, reported by Professor Rohan Gunaratne. And he says in this model that there are three important elements which are required for terrorist attacks to happen. The first is intent. The second is opportunity. And the third is capability. When these three elements converge, then only are terrorist groups able to conduct their attacks. So based on this, I looked at the Sri Lankan case. Now, intent is a very broad term and it's not quantifiable, but we can see that if we look at his organizational history of the LTTE and the campaign during the years, we see that the intent element has strongly diminished even before Prabhakaran died. Now, if we look at the post-2002 itself, LTT had significantly lost popular support, and they have lost the ideological commitment between the member groups. And also, in 2004, we saw a breakaway of Karuna Aman, who destabilized the organizational cohesion, and this was a great blow to the organizational cohesion of the LTTE. Then, we saw that in the post-war setting, nearly 12,000 LTT cadres have surrendered to the government forces. Now, this is not just a significant number itself, but it also reflects the lack of these LTT foot soldiers and other members of the group in sustaining and wanting to continue the war. And then after the humanitarian operations, we saw that the Sri Lankan government and the security forces have launched the rehabilitation program, which based on, of course, the restorative model, a restorative justice model, and the Sri Lankan government really understood how the potency of the threat of the intent and how important it is to diminish the intent of these individuals in order to protect Sri Lanka from resurgence of violence and terrorism in the future, which is why the Sri Lankan government and the armed forces have been extremely successful in the de-radicalization of the individual members and to minimize the intent of these individuals from going back to violence. Next, we have the capability. This, of course, is a very broad topic, but I have looked at operational space and funding and weaponry. Of course, as we know, the LTT has lost significant territorial control since 2007, and since then it has not regained any operational and territorial control in the country. However, we do know right now, even at the post-war phase, the pro-LTT element abroad continues to raise a lot of funds, and the international network, as we discussed earlier, is continuing its activities, and there are still ample fundings left by business ventures and different events that are taking place abroad. Then we also have hauls of weaponry that are being discovered continuously, even in the post-war setting. We always see of news that a lot of weapons have been discovered all around the island, which shows that if any LTT wanted to continue attacks today, it actually can, because it does have the weaponry and the necessary operational capabilities. But the most important thing we have to realize is that despite all the funding and the weaponry that we have and that the LTT can use, there's no one to capitalize on these capabilities because of the unique command structure which the LTT operated in. In the case of the LTTE, all of the attacks were commanded by the hierarchy and the top senior leaders. Now, with the elimination and the death of the senior leaders, along with Prabhakaran, we know that nobody is there to give directions and command for the operations, which is why, even if there is to be a terrorist attack in the future, God forbid, if there is, it will only be a very low-intensity attack conducted by a homegrown individual. And in terms of opportunity, the most important thing that Sri Lanka, since the end of the war, and even prior to the end of the war, the security forces have denied the terrorists of any opportunities for terrorists to conduct any attacks. And this is because internal security of the country has been taken a priority as a national security strategy in the post-war setting. And these include the increase of intelligence coordination and the coordination of immigration and national identification, and also, and more importantly, the military presence in strategic locations. All of these conditions have enabled Sri Lanka to strengthen its internal security so that the terrorist groups are not given any chance of conducting any terrorist attacks in the country. So, with all of these aspects, what exactly is Prabhakaran's death, and what does this mean to the end of LTTE? In fact, no one can deny that the LTT ended because of Prabhakaran's death, and his death was indeed symbolic to the end of the war. However, his death is not the sole precursor to the end of terrorism in this country, because other elements, namely the operational capability, intent, and opportunity, has been lost. Therefore, in conclusion, I'd like to say that the threat matrix does not converge in the case of Sri Lanka, which is why we have not witnessed any terrorist attacks in the country. And the most important thing is that for any countries that want to learn from the case of the Sri Lankan counterterrorism experience, crippling only the capability of a terrorist group is not conducive, because it will further increase the intent of the terrorists to conduct reprisal attacks. So therefore, the most important thing that we can learn from the Sri Lankan counterterrorism experience is to cripple all of the three elements in the threat matrix in order to ensure a strong and definite end of terrorism in the country. Thank you very much.